Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is...
Natalie Fenton.
And
Or you
Prof
want me to say more
Fenton,
about myself immediately?
there you are, Prof Fenton. You're almost in the half-light. It looks as though it might be getting a bit... It might be that moment when the sun is doing its best to keep going somewhere in London, but maybe only has an hour or so left.
Yeah, that's about right. It's actually quite a mild, nice autumnal day, but the sun is weak in that late afternoon fashion. So if I'm coming in and out of brightness and dullness, that's probably reflective of also my state of mind right now. So
Well, let me
that's
ask you about that. Rather than quote my father saying the sun is weak, tell me how things are for you. What's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you? What's going on for the prof?
Well, the world is in a pretty dire state, of course, so that preoccupies most of my waking moments, not
Mm.
least the war on Palestine and on Gaza, and now in Lebanon is, that appalling state of affairs that just seems to get worse by the minute, and the atrocities um, exerted by Netanyahu and his government really is what occupies most of my mind, and then also how the media are responding to that. So, that's really making me think a lot about the appalling state of affairs of foreign policy news reporting, actually, in the UK. And I think we all need to start looking at that in more detail in our own countries. I think that's one of the things that is actually key going forwards. It's one of the areas that I think has been blighted in many places around the world. And so, anyway, Des and I are thinking about hatching a project around that area because I think that's really vital in the places we see ourselves in. And of course, the endless anxiety that's occupying many people about the US elections, but an anxiety of Trump winning, but also an anxiety of Harris winning and what that will mean. So there's kind of, doesn't feel like there's an awful lot to look forward to. We've also got a new Labour government in the UK, so ostensibly of the left, but not really, and the endless disappointment with how they're doing on a daily basis. So that's really my global and local distractions or preoccupations of the mind that I'm trying to orient towards my scholarly life right now.
And that's quite a bit. And Des, by the way, would be Des Friedman, I'm assuming one of your colleagues. Yeah.
That is right.
It's interesting in that in terms of really doing these massive comparative studies, they've been done for things where you know when it begins and you know when it ends, like the World Cup of men's football or the Winter Olympic Games. It's got a start date, it's got an end date, it's in one place. So it's not that hard for people in different countries to look at how their media cover it. It's much more complicated when you've got something like this that is a war, but an undeclared war, and without a national rival and without a formal military rival, and where, in addition, there is no reportage on the ground available to almost all the countries that are writing about it and talking about it. Highly unusual. I mean, this is something we haven't seen really since the beginning of war journalism. I mean, even in the First World War, there were embedded reporters, right? Rupert Murdoch's father was an embed, I think.
Yeah, but it's still relevant that how that non-reporting is being reported, or how that non-ability of doing journalism is then being reported. Because we're very rarely told, in fact, that reporters are not being allowed into Gaza, and actually what is happening in that process is they are accepting accounts of events in certain ways, or certain accounts are being prioritized over others, or we're simply not getting any interrogation of decisions made by national governments in relation to Israel. So it is quite intriguing how little we're being told about military affairs, about purchasing of warfare, about all of that kind of geopolitics of armed invasion is something that is very badly covered and interrogated. Very few organisations are actually doing a critical interrogation of what's going on. And I do think that has lessened in the UK, certainly, over the last 10 years. That's, we used to have those sorts of, kind of correspondence that were maybe considered war correspondence that are now more likely security correspondence, which come with a very different inflection. And I think that's not something that people are necessarily well aware of. And we should be charting this and really figuring out why it is that and the relationships. Very few people understand the relationships between mainstream news outlets and MI5 or MI6, for example, in the UK. That is not well known. At what point do they have to get clearance, and at what point is something prevented from publication because of so-called security concerns, and whose interest is being served in that moment in time? Not well understood, I think, and has become really alarmingly obvious during the latest kind of concerns of a war on Gaza. It's not a war with, it's a war on Gaza.
No, wonderfully put, although tragically so. And in some ways, this relates to your new book, which is what we're really here to talk about. I was lucky enough to get a copy, and I've read it. It's called, just in case you've forgotten, you mentioned before we started recording that it's a while since you wrote it. It's called, Natalie, Democratic Delusions, How the Media Hollows Out Democracy and What We Can Do About It. And I should say that one of the stunning features of the book is that I think partway through, towards the end of every chapter, after you've bitched about stuff, you say, well, what on earth are we going to do about this? And you have concrete proposals. Most of us just whinge and bleat and moan.
Well, that's the hardest bit. The hardest bit is thinking about what to do. And I've always, for a long time, bemoaned the fact that many of us who call ourselves critical scholars do a very fine job of kind of wallowing in the despair of what is, but very rarely stretch our imaginations and also expand our political visions to think about what might be possible. And I really think that if a critical scholarship is, in that kind of Frankfurt School way of thinking, supposed to be emancipatory or towards emancipation, that we have a duty as critical scholars to think about how things could be otherwise. And, that is really hard. It's really, really hard. But it forces a different type of scholarship, because you have to think through, as you're thinking through and interrogating the here and now, if you're thinking about what needs to change to make things different, then how you interrogate it becomes much more expansive, I think, because you might start small. Oh, we just need to change this little bit, and you think, well, really, would that change anything at all? And suddenly things, the nature of your critique, I think, becomes broader and deeper, and so it forces a different way of thinking. But undoubtedly, I mean, it's not, and again, it's not supposed to be prescriptive in any sense of the word. It is literally, let's think beyond what we have and how things could be done differently in the name, I should say, for listeners, of transformative justice. That's the main framework. This is a progressive, transformative intent behind the book.
Maybe before we go through some of the particular concerns of the volume, you could elaborate a wee bit on transformative justice, Prof.
Yeah, this is, I came to this as what I wanted the book to be, was to be some minor level of contribution towards critical thinking around democracy. And, there's a lot been done on that. Libraries been written on writing about theories of democracy. So, I was trying to understand what it is that I wanted to look at. And it was very clear to me that we needed to break free of a certain kind of liberal capture of that word of democracy and to change it into something which was actually doing the work that would enable change. So what do we want change to be? And that's when I went through the kind of doorway or through the porthole of justice. And it was a very simple step, very simple kind of critical maneuver of saying, which direction am I pointing in? And of course, there's lots of different theories of justice as well. And so what the book is attempting to do is pull some of those together and talk about both economic justice, social justice, cultural justice, environmental justice, and say there is no one singular theory of what these are. If we're looking at this from the point of view of democracy as a way of life rather than as a mechanism of voting, then we are looking at how we can all live together well and respectfully and in comfort, actually. And that requires a theory of justice that goes with it. So it is, and I build on that from various, and you'll know I'm a bit of a kind of magpie in my theoretical thinking, is that I'm very happy to pull in strands from various thinkers to get a sense of how I think the whole might be better. And it's a bit, I always see it as a bit like doing a jigsaw puzzle. It's, I'm kind of filling in little bits of the picture at any one time, and then suddenly the whole puzzle starts to take a shape. And for me, I felt as also a kind of, die in the wool kind of old Marxist, that this was actually endlessly returned me to the critique of capitalism and how in many forms we've stopped talking about it. And I was really made aware of that from spending a semester in America. I was lucky enough to be at the University of Pennsylvania for a term, and a fantastic group of scholars working with there, but was made really clear to me that although there was an incredible critique of race, of gender, there was very little critique of capitalism. And yet, if we can't think beyond what capitalism is, we're kind of screwed, right? It's like, because actually, and so I started to think endlessly, well, if we're endlessly captured by media as capitalist enterprise, we will never get beyond thinking around all of the ills and that capitalism has created, regardless of whether that's media or any other form of industry. So that's when the focus also around justice and injustice came back to talking about the political economy of the industries. So it's an expansive thesis, which, it's meant to be. It's broad brushstroke. I wanted to try and capture a genuine, wide analysis of, why are our media not democratic, and what would it mean to make them so? And would that have any impact on what we think of democracy in society? So it's looking through the lens of kind of what's it mean to have democratic media for a democracy to come.
One of the things you do is to take us through a very expansive and generous tour d'horizon of theories of democracy. But in addition to providing exegeses and encounters between different theories, you are always quick to give examples and also to tie this to the media. So I wondered if I could ask you something else which may relate to your experiences at Penn, namely whether there are times in the study of the media or communications, whatever we call it, when it becomes too central and we miss out on wider social forces. And sometimes that comes because of a focus on representation textually, or representation occupationally, or reception of meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bit of a joke in my department at Goldsmiths where, we're endlessly said, but you never talk about the media. And I'm like, I do, honestly, I do. But it's like, a lot of my thinking comes starts in a different place. It doesn't begin with the media. So when you say what is preoccupying my thoughts, and I talk about the war on Israel, or the war by Israel on Gaza, I'm thinking through issues in the world first and foremost, and then I'm thinking about how this is, these meanings are sustained, changed, inflected by, distorted by our media and communication systems. And the book, again, talks about media in all its forms and communication systems in all their forms. So this is about, local, national, global media, from old-fashioned, legacy TV, print, broadcasting to everything online, and all the, kind of versions of that on technologies and platforms in between. So I am trying to suggest that, and that's why we come back to capitalism, because the one thing the vast majority of them have in common is that they are embedded in a capitalist mode of production. And so that is okay, what is driving? You have to change. If you want to change things for the better, you have to say what is driving it for the worst. And that is quite a straightforward analysis for me, in that it's for profit, not for public good. And, I actually think, or I hope, that the book is written in a very accessible way, although it deals with quite a lot of grand theory. The analysis is quite simple. I don't think there's, it is a kind of, I'm endlessly say to people, I don't understand why people don't name this endlessly. For me, the problem here is the pursuit of profit and the pursuit of property. And that is actually, what we've got to deal with. And why aren't we dealing with it? We're quite happy to talk about, let's tweak regulation. Really? Haven't we historically learnt that lesson? That tweaking regulation rarely changes much at all? Or it might be, let's just enable a few, new emergent practices around the edges to flourish. And that's what we mean by plurality. But they will always be drowned out and overwhelmed or, incorporated by capital. So, it's kind of, those things aren't sufficient in and of themselves. And I think I say at one point in the book, we could have a whole heap of regulation attempting to tame big tech and media industries, for liberal measures, but, really not much beyond that. We could have a whole heap of initiatives designed to grow and flourish alternative and independent media, and yet we could still be surrounded by gross social, political and economic injustices. So that's not the answer. Clearly that's not the answer, but nobody's really willing to kind of throw themselves in front of that train, because it feels like, actually, well, if you're talking about overthrowing global capitalism, Natalie, then surely you're just naive and stupid. My point is, unless we actually start talking about it, we'll never even be able to imagine it, what that other might be. So I'm happy to be claimed as, or described as naive and simplistic, because let's just name it and say what it is.
Well, Prof, when you're speaking, I can't help but think of Butskelism from the late 50s, early 60s, a term that nobody knows anymore. It was a British term that brought together the last names of two prominent figures in the dominant political parties, because they had a bipartisan approach, Rab Butler and Hugh Gaitskell, about having a compact that would ensure that you had basically some sort of diminution in inequality, and that there would be significant social welfare provision at the level of health and education and so on. Now, how was that done away with? It was done away with by people in Germany, in Britain, in the US, in Austria, perhaps more than anywhere else, and articulated in the UK context around the Institute for Economic Affairs, because they became, in a sense, the birthing figures for what we now call neoliberalism. Now, people thought they were mad as hatters when they started, absolutely mad as hatters, because what they were actually producing was a radical redistribution of income upwards. So if you're as mad as a hatter in the same basket, as it were, but a slightly different one, in fact, as the Institute for Economic Affairs, maybe you're onto something.
Mm. That's, I mean, I think it is, if we can't, we now know there are a few sure facts that we know about, the state of the world. One is that we're in climate catastrophe. The other is that we have grossly and burgeoning levels of inequality, both within nations and between nations. That's like, both of those things are dramatically implicated in our media and communication systems. So it is like, unless we address those two alarming things, I mean, I think inequality and climate catastrophe are the two kind of, just deal with them. So if you talk to anybody about, what is when we're talking about AI or the future of tech, is like, what we should be talking about first and foremost is inequality and climate catastrophe. If they are adding to those kind of contemporary crises, then let's not go anywhere near them, or let's do them very differently in any which way, because actually this is just, I can't see a way out of the fixes we are in, the very multiple global fixes we're in, until we start tackling that. So as media scholars, that should be our starting point. We shouldn't, there should be nothing else really. Everything should come back to that. So, and a theory of justice is really, runs through all of that. That is, to me, it was a way of articulating what do we mean by a just media, and that enabled me to say, okay, if we're talking about, we've spoken a lot in the field about a democratic media. I want a democratic media for justice. And that, to me, articulates it in a very different way, because democracy has become so captured by versions of liberal democracy that I think we need to, kind of really make a very precise cut with. Liberal democracy has failed. It has morphed into and been taken over by neoliberal democracy, and the forms of liberalism that remain are meaningless and are hollowed out. So it is actually, now we need to rethink what a notion of a just, and I would say because of the situation we're in, a just transformative democracy could be.
Now, Prof, getting back to what it says on the tin, democratic delusions. Who's deluded and who is deluding?
We're all deluded at one level or another, but I think myself included. But the delusions that I'm trying to weave through the book, there are really two main delusions, I think. The first is, delusions are things that are held onto even though we know they're not real, right? That's what a delusion is. And the media try and delude us constantly about their role in sustaining democracy. So we endlessly hear, particularly from, I would say, news media in all forms, that a free news media is vital to a functioning or healthy democracy. The two things are, go together like Starsky and Hutch, or, it's kind of they're inseparable. You can't have democracy unless you have a free news media. And the truth is, our media have contributed in very many ways to the demise of democracy in all its forms. If we see democracy through a particular lens, they have indeed upheld a status quo where democracy is on the demise. That is true, but they certainly haven't pushed democracy seen as something else. So I take in the book a series of concepts that I think are most relevant for a discussion of this relationship between media and democracy. So I look at, I'm going to forget them now, but I look at power, participation, equality,
freedom,
thank you, public good, trust, and hope. And I say, actually, each of those as a concept, I think is key to our understanding of what democracy could be. And then I show how the media has actually resulted in many cases in the hollowing out of those concepts, or its precise reverse. So actually the media upholds powerlessness rather than actually dealing, holding power to account. And what would it mean then. I mean, it's a good example, the whole issue of power and powerlessness, because our media endlessly tell us that what they are there for is to hold power to account. They don't do that very well, as I've just been speaking about in relation to foreign policy news, but and there are very many great studies that will show how our media fails us in that regard. But worse than that, if we actually think that democracy is about a fair and equal share of power, then what we have to deal with in society is powerlessness. And if we said to our media, okay, even if we accepted that you're holding power to account, how are you dealing with powerlessness? How are you dealing with minoritized and marginalized communities? Where are their voices? How are you, and how do they feel represented? And how are their voices used in your coverage? And we immediately see that they fail on all counts. Most of our mainstream media is very astoundingly, in the UK at least, but this is true in many places in the West, astoundingly white, astoundingly middle class, and from very privileged, highly educated backgrounds. And they produce media, most of it. There's a great journalist in the UK called Shirish Kulkarni, and he talks about most of our news media being done by the wrong people on the wrong stories in the wrong ways. And that is when you go into communities who have felt entirely disenfranchised by our systems of media and communications, that's what they tell us. So, that's if they were to be democratic media, they would have to be dealing with powerlessness. And what might that mean? And that takes us to a very different way of doing news and journalism that I think, is actually where I'm trying to point towards. What would it mean to talk about news and journalism from the position of addressing powerlessness? Something completely different. The other delusion is, that these are, we're endlessly told this thing of, our media must be free, when our media has always worked to support the powerful. These are mega corporate organizations making huge amounts of money for a very few people. They don't have public interest or the public good in their DNA. They have profit in their DNA. So, and yet we are constantly deluded by that notion that a free media is vital for democracy. So it's those two kind of plays on the word that I also talk endlessly as well, how we are deluded, the notion that democracy could be any other way. We're also deluded that that's impossible, that there is, I go in the final chapter on hope, I use one of David Graeber's arguments where he says, hope is ideological. We are instructed to believe that it's hopeless to think of a world beyond capitalism, and that is actually, that's also a delusion. That's, of course, there is a world beyond capital, and we have to begin to critique and understand what that might look like.
One of the really terrific aspects of the book is that, as you say, there are these chapters on these topics, but in each case, they engage with their antonym. So, power and powerlessness, political participation and exclusion, freedom and repression, equality and injustice, public good and private interest, trust and distrust, hope and hopelessness. And I think that's wonderfully dialectical, obviously, in the classic sense, but also it means that the what if or but arguments that a reader might have get engaged very well. Here's my query in all of this, and it's a very mundane one. I find great value in France 24, France 24, which is in English and French and Spanish, in Al Jazeera, which is in English and Arabic, in Deutsche Welle, which is in English and German and Spanish, and in the BBC, but only the BBC that's not about Britain, and the BBC that isn't by its domestic journalists. Lots that's in the World Service, I think, is really terrific. for example. And so I do see some element that can be interesting that is certainly to do with elements that are part of a capitalist system, but that retain components of the old-fashioned Mediterranean, Asia-Pacific, Northern European notion of public service broadcasting. And that some of these are phenomenally successful in getting readers all around the world who can manage in one or more of those languages. Is that any kind of model, or do you think that that is now, in a sense, part of the delusion?
Look, there's an awful lot of good journalism that goes on out there. Much of that good journalism is to be found in what we might call public service media. But when we really dig down into that public service media, I mean, my real anxiety about claiming that all we need is public service media is endlessly we turn to the model of the BBC, or we go like, and actually, you know what, that the BBC is a deeply flawed institution. And it seems to me again that we're captured by understandings of liberalism, that we are willing to accept the BBC as a kind of paragon of virtue, when it has, you know, the BBC has its, you know, chair is bestowed by the Secretary of State, which means that every new government can direct the kind of politics of the organisation. Now, there are all sorts of checks and balances to try and prevent that from happening, but we've seen more often than not that fail in recent past. We also know that the BBC is an incredibly, you know, kind of Oxbridge oriented, so elite university employee. It is, it has suffered massive cuts of late, and this is because of the pressures from a corporate environment, sacked hundreds of journalists, very many within those areas of journalism that are, you know, seen as being either the least important or the most expensive. So we go local and regional journalism gets cut and slashed first, or, you know, kind of investigative journalism and or things like, you know, kind of foreign correspondent work. So it is, you know, these are things which are need close attention. The BBC and all of those other organisations you've mentioned actually have very little by way of democratic relationship to their publics. They all have some distant complaints mechanism, but actually those complaints mechanisms are very opaque, difficult to navigate, and rarely efficient or effective. So we, as publics, are written out of most of that. And we, you and I, are very privileged publics. So the vast majority of publics who might feel completely underserved, and not only underserved, but kind of abused by those systems, have no say-so and no talk back. And that's where you come back to things about exclusions, repressions, and inequalities. And the BBC is as guilty as that as anyone, even though it is not quite as brutally obvious in its display of those characteristics as other places are. And I would defend the need for public service media to the end, really. But I also would defend the need for it to endlessly push what it sees as public media. And I just think, why would we, you know, it's a political question. So I'm kind of endlessly bemused by the fact that people who just endlessly repeat a protectionist version for that argument for that media is like, yeah, of course there's good stuff everywhere, but what's it not doing? And it, you know, there's an awful lot it could do better. So let's not settle for a kind of, you know, a liberal version of what is, you know, many people feel very poorly served by now. You know, we did a big study called The BBC and Beyond a couple of years ago, where sadly it fell during COVID, so a lot of it had to be online, but we were supposed to be doing town hall meetings all around the country. asking people what they felt of public media. And what was really interesting is nobody had a bloody clue what we meant by public service media. Nobody understood that term. When we started talking about what should a people's media be, they got very excited. And that was what, a lot of this thinking came out of that work. It was like, actually, okay, nobody has a clue what public media is. Most of them would say they thought the BBC was state broadcasting, which was alarming to me because it's not at most levels. But that, that lack of independence is an not and yet the notion, when you say what would a people's media look like, they went in a completely different direction. So why not think about that rather than just being happy to grab at the crumbs of public service broadcasting that we have left?
One of the things that you valorize in the book as one of the potential ripostes to these problems is a cooperative model of journalism in particular. Could you speak a bit about the virtues of that?
Well, one of the claims in the book is that if we're talking about what democracy could become, then we also have to think of that locally, about how we function democratically as in all organisations, and not least the media. So if you have a media organisation which operates with a very elite hierarchy, whereas only certain people get to the top and they make all the decisions on the production, content and dissemination, then it will clearly be oriented in a particular direction. So having a cooperative structure is one that's tried to deliberately tackle that question. And it's looked at the ways in which all of its decision making is made as an organisation. So there are good examples within the UK now, and very many, particularly local media, that are trying to take the shape of a cooperative media. There's lots of different types of co-ops. But if you're a multi-stakeholder co-op, for example, or a workers' co-op, you will have a slightly different way of being. But the intent is that power is equally shared across those stakeholders or those constituents. So Bristol Cable in the UK is a local newspaper built on a subscription model, with a sliding scale of subscriptions. So the very poorest in society can afford it, and even the highest level of subscription is not very high. And anyone who is a subscriber has a say in the editorial direction of that newspaper, the advertising policy of the newspaper, the sorts of issues that it thinks that paper should take on board. And these are meetings that are held regularly by the newspaper itself with the local community, and they're packed. They are packed, vibrant meetings, because they see the Bristol Cable as a newspaper doing great things for dealing with powerlessness and holding power to account. And they're trying, they don't get it right all the time. They would be the first to admit that. They are, as a journalistic cohort, they're not as diverse as they could be. They're trying to tackle that, but they are doing it consciously, and they are trying to deal with injustices. So again, it's not for profit or for small profit. Any profits that are made are fed back into the journalistic endeavour and not into the shareholders' pockets. So it's a completely different understanding. And those sorts of organisations are growing actually around the world. And it's, we now know that they're, the whole idea of tech co-ops as well is platform co-ops is, again, one that is growing and developing on the basis that if we simply repeat the models that are out there and keep repeating the forms of news and journalism that have failed us so far, we're not going to be changing anything.
Prof, I've got one more question for you, if I may, and then I'd like to throw it back to you to add anything you want. Something about the book that we haven't discussed that you want to highlight, or something we have mentioned that you'd like to go back over. Does that sound okay as a way of concluding matters?
Yes, absolutely.
So I want to take you back to 1968. Now,
I was only two.
let me tell you what it was really like. So, because I turned 10, so of course I know everything. Now, for many people, the word 1968, if it signifies anything, means Paris, Prague, Berkeley, the protest by African American athletes at the Mexico City Olympics, the murder of Martin Luther King, the murder of Bobby Kennedy, the war in Vietnam. Plenty of other things one could talk about, but the Prague Spring ending, lots of tragedy, but also a moment of hope. Something else happened that year. That's when Garrett Hardin published his notorious essay called The Tragedy of the Commons. And that essay has become, I think, really the linchpin argument in favor of enclosure and against having a commons on behalf of a particular kind of ecology, because he wrote that as an ecologist, saying, once we carve these things out as private property, A, people care about them, get invested in them emotionally and socially, but B, they are prepared to act rationally and often collectively to protect their property. Whereas the commons is something that gets basically abandoned and becomes chaotic, apart from whatever form of government there might be to deal with it, right? It's a sort of Lockean argument that this is how we save nature. So I'm not asking you to think about this as a 2-year-old, but you could if you wanted to. What's your argument for why the commons, which is mentioned quite a bit in your book, actually can be more effective than that critique that Hardin made and I guess has remained central to the capitalist environmentalist argument ever since?
Well, because that argument's failed. That argument, we are now, it's completely wrong. People have not, the protection of private property is only available to those who are able to have property in their portfolio in that way, whatever that might be. And that is fewer and fewer and fewer people. So the ability to purchase is simply gone. That's it, okay, you say people will be invested in that, but that's where, kind of capitalism has been misfooted, because it is, for capitalism to survive, it has to make far more people successful capitalists. If it's very few people who are actually able to thrive under capitalism, then Hardin's argument falls. Because actually, the tragedy is with capitalism and not with the commons. And that's what people feel. So it is actually, when I did another research project that was going just post-Brexit and pre-COVID, going around the country we called it a deep dive into 9 of the most impoverished areas in the UK, well, in England actually, not the UK. And the argument that we were getting back, and this was, again, it was not directed at the media at all, it was about civic futures and civil society futures. And what we were hearing time and again is precisely the opposite, was because people have been told to seek out their own self-interest, we have lost sight of taking care of each other. And that's what we want to get back. So it was precisely the opposite. And actually, we have so little trust in those systems because they have shafted us so badly that now we want the power to look after each other, because that system has failed us. And that's where all of the arguments around, the politics of care come into play. Hardin's argument is only works if you believe that people don't particularly care about each other. But actually not caring about each other doesn't do capitalism any favours either, because those businesses need people with money who can actually keep them going and support them and keep them thriving. So, it simply doesn't work. It's a naive economics at the very best. So I think it's a nonsense. Actually, for societies to thrive, we need far less inequality. We need systems of egalitarianism across the board, and then all businesses would thrive. Actually, this is not an anti-money, anti-business argument. It's an anti-capitalist argument. You can have businesses without capitalism. And that's, again, you can have media cooperatives that function and sustain and do wonderful jobs and pay their journalists well without profit.
Prof, anything you'd like to add to what we've said?
Well, I was going to come back to the idea of that kind of developing those ideas around the commons, because I do think that, we get stuck in our fields all the time around notions of, either public service broadcasting is the answer or public service media. And I want us to think much more broadly than that, as to think about media as being about a kind of communicative freedoms. And that, I think, takes us into a different direction of thinking. It's not just about the cultural industries. What does it mean to talk about communicative freedoms and just communicative democracy? And that's where I'm hoping the book kind of orients our thinking. And that's all that I really hope for, is that it opens up some windows of possibility in people's minds. But thank you for the opportunity, Toby, to talk about it.
Thank you, Professor Natalie. It was great to learn from you, as it always is. The book is terrific. It's available at all good, I guess one doesn't say good bookstores, since there are no bookstores, and those that are there are all...
Booksellers.
Booksellers. Got it. It's terrific.
Back the capitalism.